If you don't mind, Rabbi, I'll interrupt you if I see them coming.
Yeah, okay.
Get the page number, please.
Okay, so we're on Chof Zion Amud Aleph, the top, about 6 lines from the top, there's a Mishnah. We're starting that Mishnah Chof Zion Amud Aleph. Very interesting Mishnah on a somewhat new topic. Obviously, we're continuing about Metzias, but here the Gemara and the Mishnah and the Gemara are going to talk about the source for the sources in the Torah, which we're going to look at in a minute, for a number of the inyanim that we've been discussing here over the many weeks. So what I want to do is I want to read a couple of psukim in Devarim, Parshas Kitzei, Perek Chof Beis Amud Aleph, if anybody wants to read along. These several psukim are very critical to our understanding of this whole Gemara we're going to be studying today. So the Torah says as follows. Lo sira eshor achicha os say nidochim v'salamta mehem. You should not see your brother's ox or sheep that are he says cast off, but they're nidochim, they're in difficulty v'salamta mehem, and you should hide your eyes. Remember, we talked about one of the mitzvahs losa says lo salamta, that you should not avert your eyes from an event that you can help. So in addition to Hashavas Avedas, there is the negative mitzvah lo salamta. So you shouldn't see this event and turn your eyes. Hoshev teshivem leochicha, you should return it to your brother. In other words, if you see the shore, now here particularly the shore and the seh, that's an ox and a sheep, you have to return them. Now, next pasuk, and if your brother is not close to you, is not near you, below yadato, and you don't know who he is, then you have to take the animal into your house, and you have to feed the animal, clothe the animal, do whatever you have to do. We're not going to focus on that part of it because that's a whole separate set of halachas, but you have an obligation to not just let that animal not be fed and taken care of. So that there's a mitzvah there. That's not really the subject of our discussion. Now, third pasuk, v'chein tase lechamoro. So he talked about an ox and a sheep. Okay, fine. Now you should do the same thing to your chamor. So you might be thinking, why is the Torah delineating an ox, a sheep, a chamor? So keep that important question in mind, because that's really a main subject of our Gemara. And then the same you should do for his shirt, for his garment, for his clothing. Okay, so having singled out 4 different categories, right? Shor, ser, chamor, and simla. Then the Torah tells us, and by the way, you have to do that to anything that your friend loses. So he identified 4, and then he gives you a sui generis comment, everything. Asher tova mimenu, that he loses, umotsosa, and you find. A second time, you can't avert your eyes. So when you stop to think, when we read the Torah, maybe we don't really focus on this, but these 3 psukim, especially the first and the third, are very, very instrumental in our understanding of this whole mitzvah shor saveda. You have a shor, you have a seh, you have a chamor, you have a simla, a garment, and then anything and everything. So what pops into our head the minute we read this? If it's everything, what do you have to identify them from? It's every single thing. You should lo yasalamta and hashev teshiveh. Okay, that's the Torah. So it's important to understand the context of which we're now about to start our Mishnah. So now let's go to Chof Zayin Amud Aleph, and we're going to start the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, Af hasimla hoisa bechlal kol elu. Even the garment was included in all of these. Rashi says, what do you mean, Af hasimla? Rashi says, the Gemara Mefarshla, the Gemara is going to explain to us what these words mean. But that's basically what I just alluded to, is that also the simla is included in all of these. Balama Yatzes, and why is it mentioned specifically when the Torah says kol avedas achicha? So the Mishnah says lahakish alea, to compare loy melach ma simla meyuchedes. Simla is very specific. Sheyesh bo simanim, because every garment, every outfit has some kind of a siman. The yesh lo tovin, and it has owners. It has people who will pursue it. Tovim, people who will claim it. Af kol davar sheyesh bo simanim, yesh bo tovim chayev lahachriz. So too, from this simla, we learn that any item that has an inherent siman in it, and it has someone to return it to. A toveya is someone who claims. So basically, it means you have to return it to somebody. Those are the characteristics of a simla, says the Mishnah, as to why it's telling us a simla, even though it generically says you return everything. So we're learning from the word simla, what are the characteristics of chayav lahachris? Has to be a siman. You have to have a siman somehow to say, it have my initials on the shirt pocket or something, and there is who to return it to. All right, so let's look at Rashi. Okay, so Rashi, lama yitzasa v'chein tasa l'simla. So why do we specify v'chein tasa l'simla when we have a generic comment? Stam simla yesh bo siman. A simla, a garment has some kind of siman. And a garment has owners. Tovim also shlonasis ele biyade adam lo bos v'nehefker. So it's coming to teach us that you have to have these two characteristics to exclude something that is hefker. In other words, if something is hefker, we know because we've learned that you don't have to return it. So here, the Mishnah is giving us chapter and verse that the reason why it says simla is because simla has a siman, simla has an owner, it's not hefker, and as Rashi will say in a minute, no one was miyayish it, no one gave up on it. So these are the important considerations.
Yeah, excuse me, Rabbi, if I can ask a question. In those days, everything was handmade. Clothing was handmade by somebody who made it. And so therefore there might be a siman because each one was handmade.
Right.
How does that hold up today when you have mass production of clothing and there's no siman that says it belongs to any person unless it's, a small percentage of clothing is personalized maybe, but so much of it is just mass manufactured. Does this whole notion of a siman on clothing sort of go away?
No, that's an excellent question. Is because if it's mass produced, then how are you going to identify your shirt from someone else's shirt? Unless, of course, you did something to the shirt that made it yours, right? But it's a good question. So in other words, if I lost a shirt or I lost some item that I wanted to be able to prove.
The laundromat messes it up and returns.
Okay, so here's a good example. We all go to shul. Sometimes someone takes my coat and I don't have a coat. So now what am I going to do? I'm going to announce it was a black coat that was on a hanger in the shul, approximately here, there, and then you see three other coats that are lined up next to mine, and none of them are mine. So how am I going to identify? It's a very good question. I don't think there is a specific answer to that question other than someone will say, you know what?
Choose the one
About my coat was something about my coat that I remember was unique, maybe because among the coats that were there, I had a label that made me slightly ripped, or I had a label that said, I don't know, what's the brand name, Brooks Brothers, and there was no other Brooks Brother coat there. But it is an issue because the individual somehow has to be able to identify his garment. But generically, a simla, in most cases, certainly in the time of the Gemara, had a siman. It had something that was unique to the garment, but it's a good question how you identify your siman from somebody else's siman. All right, so maybe it's Sarachia, maybe we have to look into that a little bit more, but the fact of the matter is that you're right, as we get mass production, it's going to be harder and harder to single out. But
When it comes to the animals that are listed, they usually have something on them indicated who owns them or something.
Right, yeah.
In those,
but you're right with the garment, because I mean, you talk about an animal or anything else, there you may be more unique. There's something unique maybe about my dog to your dog, but when you're producing 100,000 of these objects just off the assembly line, it's going to become very difficult to actually understand what the siman is. So it's a good question. Let's hold that thought and we'll think about it, and maybe there'll be something that maybe one of the Meforshim, again, you're talking in the time of the Gemara, not our time, but okay.
Well, one comment on that actually is, on the one hand, if the man with the truck comes to town and you find in the parking lot the next day a packaged white shirt, okay, it could be 100 people bought that same shirt that day, but that's the mass production thing. But the flip side is, there are times I'll go to shul, and if I see somebody who has on a weekday the exact same shirt that I happen to be wearing, not a plain white shirt, okay, but something else, it's like, wow, it's a big deal. Wow, you got the same shirt I did, even though I know 10,000 people in the country must have it. To actually find somebody else in the same town who has the exact same shirt, it actually is unusual. And so the particular pattern and stuff, even mass production, can still, I think, function as a siman in some ways.
Right, but also keep in mind that if there's one simla that's lost, it's not as if everybody lost a simla. One person lost a simla, and he's going to come and say, you know what? I lost a shirt. It was blue and white with stripes with a couple of buttons. In other words, describing the shirt that you're wearing now, and that was my shirt. Then l'chayra, if he's coming and describing it, and that's the only symbol that was lost, you're not going to have someone else who doesn't own the shirt who's going to come and say, I lost a shirt that was blue and white with stripes with buttons. So even though it may not be miyuchad, the only shirt in the world, there's enough going there, there's enough description that you can believe him that he lost that shirt, because otherwise, he would come and tell you, oh, it was a green shirt with dots and this and that and the other. Of course, that never happened. So even so, there is something about you're giving the simanim, even if it isn't the only shirt like it. Different would be if 3 people lost the same shirt, and there was one shirt found, and I said, oh, it was a striped shirt, and you said it was a striped shirt, and the third guy said it was also blue with a striped shirt. There you'd have a real issue. But when someone is coming to describe a siman, even though it's not miyuchad, the only shirt in the world, nevertheless. So what the Torah is telling us, simlaso, is that there are simonim to a simla. Again, it's not saying it's the only simla, it's the only shirt like it, but there is the potential for a siman, and that's what we're learning from that word's thing.
When you take a look at Telesim, though, Telesim in the shul, they pretty much all look alike. I mean, it's very difficult. Now, some people have distinctive, borders and so on, but for the most part, a talis is a talis.
Right, but something, I'll bet that if 3 people have the same talis with the same everything, that there's going to be something in the way either he wore it or one of the tzitzis may have been maybe there was a rip in the corner of one tzitzit. These things happen all the time, so it may not be totally identical. But again, the point is well taken. Is that today this idea of a siman on a simla is a little bit different than it would have been in the time of the Gemara, where maybe there was more one of a kind. But anyway, the point is, what are the criterion? The criterion are that it was a siman and that it was owned. Says Rashi in the last Rashi, afkol sheyesh lo tovin. So that's on a siman. Anything that has a toveya, an owner, the ute midi diyoden beidem miyayish. So in other words, it's excluding hefker and it's excluding yiyush. So that if someone was miyayish, it doesn't have a toveya anymore. It doesn't have an owner. That's what the Mishnah wants to single out simla among all of the other generic loss of items, is to tell you that there are these two characteristics that make a simla special. Okay, so that's how the Mishnah is trying to explain our pasuk in the Torah, but we're only getting started here because he's only talking about simla. So simla is different because simla has simonim and simla has ownership. Break the Gemara, my bechlal kol elu. When the Mishnah says afa simla hoisa bechlal kol elu, what does that mean? Because Rashi said the Gemara mafarish. What does it mean? It's included in all of these. Says the Gemara, Amarava bechlal kol avedas ochicha. Remember the pasuk said, we read about v'chein tasa l'chamora, v'chein tasa l'simlosa, v'chein tasa l'chol avedas ochicha. So right after the word simla, and he says, and so should you do, meaning what? Call out to return. All avedas ochicha. So that the Gemara says, my bechlal kol elu, Amarava bechlal kol avedas ochicha. So that's the answer. That's the answer the Gemara gives. Frank the Gemara Amarava Lama Li the Kasav Rachman. Okay, so that's Simla. Told us about Simla. Frank Amarava Lama Li the Kasav Rachmana. Why did the Torah write Shor Chamor Seb Simla? Why did they write all four? Says the Gemara Tzrichi. Now the Gemara is going to give us an explanation of why it singled out all four of those things and then said Kol Avedas Achicha, which was including everything else. So here's that Gemara. The Ikasiv Rachmana Simla, if the Torah would have said just Simla, Hava Amina Hanamili, I would have thought, when do you have to return? Be'edim de Gufa, V'simonim de Gufa. Only when there are witnesses to the property and simonim to the property. What does he mean by witnesses and simonim? He means that there is something concrete that a person can say, yes, this belongs to such and such a person. Okay. When you say Eidim de Gufa, we're talking about, oh, maybe someone actually was an aid and saw that he owned that particular property. In other words, you have unique characteristics to similar that you may not have to other things. And therefore, that's the only time you have to return. Abu Chamor, but a donkey, be'edim de ukuf, if you have witnesses to a saddle, or v'simonim de ukuf, and simonim to the saddle, ema lo mahadrinan lei, what happens if a person lost a donkey, it wandered off, and it had a saddle on its back? And you have nothing to say about the donkey. It's a donkey like every other donkey. But you can say, you know, I had a saddle, and in that saddle, there were 3 scratches on the lower left-hand side of the saddle. And
if it was Bilam's donkey, it has a lot to say about you, but that's another matter.
That's another matter.
Excuse
Okay.
me, Rabbi.
That's another story. Right.
Rabbi, excuse me, Jay Marcus, do you have any things like Refuah Shlema or anything? You're muted.
Okay. So what are you doing? You're describing the saddle, not the chamor. And you're saying, you know what? That saddle is mine because it has 3 scratches on the lower left. So you would think lo mahadrin and lay, that you don't return the donkey because he didn't address the donkey. Says the Gemara, Kasav Rachmana Chamor. The Torah then specifically identified a chamor as one of the items you have to return. So it singled out a chamor because a chamor usually has, it maybe meant a horse too, but he says a chamor because it has a saddle, but you only address the saddle. Says the Gemara, that's enough to you to get the chamor back, even though, because it's not likely that if you address the ukaf, the saddle, that the saddle was on a different chamor. or was on some other animal. So that's pshat chamor. Now, simla, because it has simonim and ownership. Chamor, to tell us that even if you don't identify the chamor, but you identify something that the chamor would have had on it, that's sufficient. That's the second reason. In other words, of the four things that the Torah says, we now have simla and chamor. Okay, fine.
One comment, just now we're talking about chamor a little bit. I was looking at Psukim, I found it interesting, and I a quick look at the art school, I didn't see anything. I'm sure their Perushim will come up with much more profound thoughts than me about it. But I find it interesting that the three animals, it's Shur, Seh, and Chamor. Number one, Shur and Chamor within a few psukim have other halachos about them besides returning them. And then the other thing is that those are three that are specifically mentioned, particularly with Pidyon Haben, that Shur and Seh, and then Chamor being the one particular non-kosher animal where you have the Pidyon. And so I don't think it may not have any direct bearing. As you said, a horse would probably have very similar rules as far as returning, but I think there are very specific reasons why these were picked.
Yeah, exactly. So the chamor here, that was, again, I don't know what other animals they had that they used as beasts of burden. So chamor, we know. If they had other beasts of burden, it probably would be more or less included into this category. But he doesn't want to use shor because that's a different category of something else. Now, it could have been there was a shor that was saddled. I don't know how many times they take an ox and saddle it and ride it. Maybe they did. I don't know. But it's a symbolic thing to tell us that if you have a chamor with a saddle or any other animal like it with a saddle, but you can't identify the animal. It looks like every other animal. Like Jay, now you're talking about one chamor looks like another chamor, and like a similar is one thing, but now you have animals. But still, the ukaf, which is an essential part of what they use on the chamor, is enough to identify. And says the Gemara, even the chamor with simonia ukaf, you can do. Okay, let's take a look at Rashi. Shor b'chamor seh b'simla lo tira ashur achicha oseh v'chein tasel chamor v'chein tasel simlasa. B'simonia ukaf im ein lo siman b'chamor. He can't say, oh, my chamor had a white and speckled streak behind the right ear. Okay, I mean that's pretty unusual. If he says that, that's fine. But let's assume there were no simonim on the chamor. The yeshlo simon be'ukuf shalav, but he has a simon on the saddle. It's enough. Because of Rachman chamor, kro yisera l'drasha. Otherwise, there's no reason to say the word chamor in the Torah, and that's the reason why we say it. Okay, weiter. Good. Now let's go to the other two, because chamor and simla were in one pasuk, and in the other pasuk we said Notira eshor achicha oseh nidachim v'salamta. Okay. Shor v'seh, the cause of Rachmana lamali. Now, why do we need shor v'seh? We already have a simla and an animal. And for the Gemara, shor da'afilu legizas zinavo, to teach us with a shor that even the shavings of its tail, in other words, there was hair growing on the tail, and I guess it was what they used to do is that they shave the tail in order to make the hair come out nicer or look better, whatever reason, but they shaved that tail. So now you have hairs from that tail. What do you do with those hairs? Says the pasuk, you have to return the hairs that you shaved. And also a sheep for its shearings. In other words, you have a sheep and it's sitting there and it's growing bigger and bigger and bigger because all of the wool is accumulating on the animal's back, and pretty soon you can't see the animal anymore. So what you need to do is you need to shear it and then start again. What do you do with those shearings? Says the Torah, those shearings have to be returned together. When someone says, this is my animal, and gives you this, whatever the simonim, you have to return the shearings. So now we have those two categories. Let the Torah say just short. Right? If the Torah told me only shor, and the only thing about the shor is the hair on the tail, and you're responsible to return that, isn't it a kal v'chomer? Doesn't everybody now know that the shearings of a lamb of a seh have to be returned? If you have to return the hairs I mean, who does anything with the hair of a tail? Maybe they do, but if the hair of a tail has to be returned, of course you have to return. So in other words, he's asking, okay, I get sure, but why seh? Seh should automatically be included. So the Torah should say, Eshor achicha, and I would know seh. That's the kasha. Well, Kolchkin seh legazosa. So that's the Gemara's kasha. Ela Omar Rava, comes Rava, and he says, it makes the following comment. And it's a little bit tricky because we have to understand. We're going to have to understand there's a machlokes here between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, which we'll address in a second. Okay. The Kolchkin said, Ela Omar Rava, Chamor Debor, Rabbi Yehuda. Chamor Debar, like Rabbi Yehuda. So now, what is that all about? So let's take a look. We have it in Shemos. Where's the pasuk? Okay, the pasuk in Shemos tells us that if a person digs a bar, or uncovers an existing bar, and let's say an animal falls into it, then what's the halacha? So there's a machlokes there between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda. So let's take a look at Rashi. Chamor debar Rabbi Yehuda, the mechayev al niske kelim babar. So according to the Chachamim, the only thing that you're chayiv is damage to the chamor. But let's say the chamor had kalim, and those kalim were smashed when it fell into the hole. You're not chayiv on the kalim, according to the Chachamim. Rabbi Yehuda says the mechayev al niske kalim babor. Kashalon lamai asa the ilu rabbanon maboyle shor v'lo adam chamor v'lo kalim. According to the Chachamim, we have a drasha that shor, if a shor, let's say a person was leading a shor and they fell into the hole. The shor dies and the man breaks a leg. What are you chayav for? According to the Chachamim, you're chayav for the shor, but not for the man. There is no chiyuv for the damage to the man. Chamor below kalim. Chamor falls in with the saddle and kalim. You're chayav for the chamor, but not for the kalim. That's the Chachamim. Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, says you're chayav for everything. If you're chayav for everything, then what's the chiddush? If everything is always chayav, if you have a bar and a person falls in with kalim and the shor falls in with kalim or whatever it is, you're always chayav. Then what's the chiddush? What's it telling us?
Right.
There is no chiddush. It's only a chiddush when you have an exclusion. Chamor below kalim, shor below adam. Then there's a chiddush. You know why it says shor? It excludes a human being. You know why it says chamor? To exclude kalim. So the kasha here is, according to Rabbi Yehuda, why is the Torah telling us these words? There's no chiddush in the words of chamor and shor. That's what the Gemara's kasha is.
Right.
Again, Ela Marava, no. Chamor debar Rabbi Yehuda v'seh de aveda l'divrei hakol kasha. So Rabbi is asking the kasha a little different. The chamor that falls into a bore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, and seh, a sheep, the aveda, because seh is kind of the emblem, if you will be, or the symbol for lost items. So the Gemara is asking, why do we need these two things? We don't need either of them, because if we have simla and we have shor, we've covered all contingencies. So according to Rava, there's no real reason to say chamor, according to Rabbi Yehuda, of course, and also seh. So before we asked the kasha, seh lamali, because we said it had to do with shearings. But shearings we already know from shor. We don't need seh to tell us shearings. So the Gemara wants to say, oh, wait a minute, seh is la aveda. But for la aveda, we don't necessarily need it for aveda. So the Gemara's kasha here is, what are we doing with these two superfluous words in the Torah? Chamor and seh. Now, we use the term chamor, we've said before, Chachamim and others, because of ukaf. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, there'd be no reason to say the word chamor, because chamor is generic for anything that falls, any damage is included. So it's a little bit of a cryptic question, but that's what Rav is asking. He's trying to understand, again, from the lashon of the Torah, why you need chamor and why you need seh. So now Rava has a different tact. Says the Gemara, Ela Amar Rava. So the Gemara says the Ema Leglolim. Wait a minute. You know why we need seh? Because it's Leglolim, Huda also. The excrement from a seh should be returned to the Baal. Why? Because it has useful purposes, fertilizer. So you would have had to have him in. You know why the Torah says seh? Because seh, you have to return not only the seh, but also the glalim, the excrement. Says Rashi, lahachzir as glalav, the ikos of shor, havaminim ki osa legiza zinvoy osa. If it had said only shor, I would have thought, you know what, you have to return a shor because of the hair on its tail. Abagalolim lo chashivi, but the excrement has no value, lo lahader, and you don't have to return it. That's why it says the word seh to include something that you wouldn't learn from shor. That's what the Gemara is havamina here is. We're trying to rack our brain. Why do we say shor and seh? Shor is enough to cover the hair and the shearings. So he says because it's glalim.
How does seh prove that? Maybe I should let you go further, but how does seh prove that?
How does it do it?
Yes. How does seh prove the gloaling?
No. We're interpreting that seh. There's another reason for saying seh in the Torah.
And so we're thinking the reason must be because you wouldn't think that something ostensibly worthless is included. Comes the seh to tell us that. I don't see how.
Okay. You're sitting around the table and you're darshaning here, and you're saying, you know, the Torah says shor v'seh. Torah doesn't use an extraneous word. We know shor because of giza zanva. Okay, which also includes the wall on a seh. Perfectly fine. What do we need seh for? So you are sitting with your other Talmidei Chachamim and saying, what is it about a seh? I mean, we're saying the seh because the Torah says seh. What does a seh have that is extra? So
okay, because we need to ascribe now something more to the seh.
Correct.
The seh may have other things, but we can't find them, so we're thinking it must be that. Okay.
That's it.
This is one other thing the seh has that we didn't get addressed.
That's exactly right. So in other words, we're saying, you know what? The seh, every animal makes galalim.
Right.
Right. But why is it said there? Right. To include galalim from every animal, because galalim has a value.
Right.
So if you have an animal and you keep it there for a week and you have all this galalim, you have now fertilizer for your field. That obviously had extreme value. So again, if you could have figured out something else that the seh delivers, that's okay.
Well, an animal that doesn't have any other value. There must be some animals that don't provide. They're not beasts of burden. You can't use them for any other purpose. I mean,
right, but every seh produces, every animal produces galalim, so therefore
they do. But the seh confuses you because it can do other things as well.
Right. But a seh does nothing other than eat and produce wool. A seh is useless. Let's just say
produce wool.
But wool we know from shor.
Oh, okay, I see. All right.
So wool we know from shor.
Okay, so then why
does the Torah tell us
extraneous? Okay, all right.
The Gemara's havamina here is galalim. That's because of galalim. But we're not finished.
Okay.
Frank the Gemara, galalim afkufki mafkalahu. But that's not true. Because says Rashi, afkur mafkalahu lemisha tarach bo lo asa kral ravir de ain lo toven hu. Wait a minute. No. a person who takes care of this seh for me, I want to show him some gratitude. I mean, he fed it. I'm not mechayev to pay him anything. Let him at least have the glolim, because he can use the glolim too. So we're saying that it can't mean glolim because people are mafkir. They make it hefker, the glolim. They don't really care to control the hefker, the glolim, because they say that the person who takes care of the seh should have some benefit, because he's somehow there's no, he's a shomer chinam, as it were. So you can't collect money from the owner. You can't say, I fed your animal, because the Torah says that you have to take care of the animal, right? It doesn't say that you get compensated for taking care of the animal. If that's the case, then what am I going to get back? Torah says you're going to get back that you're going to get the glolim. So in other words, we're back. So what are we going to get from this? The seh? Says the Gemara. Maybe seh is coming to teach us simonim. What's pshat simonim? That you will be able to identify your seh because it has some simonim. Again, we went through this with the symbol, but put the symbol aside for a minute. So your sheep that you've raised, you can say that it has some siman that you're going to be able to identify as to what it is. So let's say that seh comes to teach us simonim, that this whole concept of simonim, that you can reclaim your animal because you identify it through simonim. Let's say that that's what it is coming to teach us. And weiter, the boyalon, because we had a kasha, simonim de araisa or de rabbana. Is simonim min Torah, or is it a rabbinic decree that simonim can help identify an object? Kosav Rachmana seh. Again, this is what we want to learn pshat. So the Torah says seh, da'afilu b'simonim mahadrinin b'simonim deraisa. So in other words, we want to learn out that since the Torah said seh has no other purpose, right? So we're going to say it's simonim, and it's min Torah because the Torah says seh. So now we're going to say that simonim are midoraisa. If that was the discussion, okay. But again, the Gemara is struggling with why the word seh is singled out in the Torah. So we tried to say it was glolim. We say it has nothing. No, it's not glolim because the person doesn't care about glolim. Then we said it's because of simonim. And then we asked Akasha if it's simonim, are they midoraisa or midrabanan, right? And because the Torah says seh, we're going to extrapolate that it means simonim doraisa. Right? The Gemara, midik tana lahutana simonim gabi simla, biktani ma simla miyuchedesh yesh b'simonim yesh b'tovim chayv lahakris avkol dovish yesh b'simonim yesh b'tovim chayv lahakris. How can you tell me that seh, the purpose of seh, is because it has simonim? We just got through the Gemara saying that simonim was one of the two things we learned out from Simla. So you can't use it double. You can't say simonim is one of the reasons for Simla, and now we're going to say simonim is what we learn out of seh. It's again. So the kasha is what do we do with seh? And for the Gemara, shema mina the seh lo simonim hu da'asa. So we're in a quandary now. We're in a quandary. Why did the Torah identify seh? Okay, that's the kasha. Because Rabbi tried to find any kind of an excuse as to why seh was included, and now we don't have an answer. So now you can come. So everybody can come up with their own answer. Why is seh identified in the Torah? If it doesn't, because shor could have been enough to cover it. You can't use seh for simonim because that's similar. So the poor seh is now out.
How did we knock out glolim, which was unique to the seh?
Because we said that most people make it hefker, and they allow the person who took care of the
to have it as a little compensation.
As compensation, right? So now we can no longer learn glolim. So now the Torah is, the Gemara is grasping here and trying to find a reason because they can't find a reason. Why should seh be identified? We don't need seh. And so the Gemara, it leaves you with the kasha, by the way. We don't know why seh was included. What does seh bring to the table that you don't have with chamor and simla and shor? So, so Rava doesn't have an answer. Rava doesn't have an answer. So everybody can hypothecate that there's something about a seh that makes it miyuchad, that we can say it's different than another animal, and therefore it brings something to us. Yeah.
But we're
You
not really.
have to ask a shepherd. A shepherd would know the behavior of a seh compared to a shore or something else, because in general the sheep are very, very calm animals. I think when they herd them, there's there's certain things about its personality that may be representative with other animals compared to the ox. You know what I'm getting at? It's
Right, it's a different category. It's a different category. Yeah, but I understand your point. But what is it that we're trying to? In other words, each one of the others has a concrete form of reason why you call it out. Simla because of that. Chamor because of ukaf. Shor because of the hair on the tail. In other words, there are physical reasons for each of these animals to separate them out from the general words of everything of whatever is lost, you have to announce. Right? So what is seh contributing to that conversation?
Didn't Moshe also was a shepherd for seh?
Right. He took the seh.
And David also.
For carbon, yeah.
So there's something about a seh, and I think it goes back to their personalities or some aspect of how they stay together and they don't run away. Some of the others may run away, and they may represent a category of those animals that behave in a certain way. And you can learn other animals if it's similar to a seh. That's my conjecture.
I agree.
Is it possible that with the chamor and with the ox that they recognize their owner, whereas the seh does not?
They do what? They
recognize their owner. I think even Tanakh says something about an ox knows its owner's feeding trough.
Well, actually,
yeah, that wasn't it.
And actually, we have another example, which is, if I remember correctly, the whole issue of how many levels of penalty payment that it's if somebody steals an animal, that it's more for a seh because he has to carry the seh out, if I remember correctly. To carry the seh. Right. That is where some animals it's only 4, but rather some animals it's 5, but I think it's with the seh it's 4 because of the embarrassment, because he has to actually carry the animal out and so on.
You have to pay daled v'hei, right?
Right.
But how would that affect?
How does that relate to here? I'm not sure, but there's something.
A different kind of category.
Yeah, look, we can hypothesize a lot of different reasons. Turns out Rava didn't have a good reason. Right. Rava said, "I'm stuck. That I don't know why it says seh in the Torah. There's not enough here that a seh would distinguish itself from the other animals." So again, these are all plausible things, that a seh represents a more docile animal, or represents maybe who knows, maybe there's something else we can think about. So we have to take a look, and
just seems like the Avos were involved with.
None of the Rishonim, Tosfos doesn't say anything, and none of the other Rishonim really come up with any plausible answer. So maybe we have to take a look further.
Question.
We don't have any of the Avos having herds of ox or herds of other kinds of animals. I don't know if there were horses there.
Oh, Yaakov had, you go through the whole thing, he had all kinds of animals, because the whole thing with the tribute to Esav and so on, and then how much he got from Lavan and so on, he had all different types of animals.
Right. So, all right, we'll have to maybe, we'll take a look again. I'll see if any of the I didn't see anything in any of the other Meforshim that I was looking at to see, but Rava clearly has a difficult time in understanding as to what the seh adds to the equation. Okay. All right, so let's just move into the next segment, which is going to be a lot longer, but let's just start. Tana Rabbanan. Tana Rabbanan. Asher Tovat. So remember in the pasuk made mention of all of these individuals and said Asher Tovat, that you lost after identifying the individuals. Says the Gemara. Parat la'aveda she'ein bo shava pruta. So from here, from this word, say it's actually machlokes between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda. But so from this word, we learn out that the only time you have to call out an aveda, Shabbos aveda, is asher tovad, that it's worth a pruta. Says Rashi. Asher tovad shete kruya aveda. In order for it to be called an aveda, it has to be shava pruta. That's the Tanakam. That's the Chachamim. Comes Rabbi Yehuda Omer umotsasa prat la aveda she'en bo shava pruta. So now we have a different drash. We learn it out from. Let me get the pasuk again, and we'll read the pasuk, and we're going to see what this machlokes is about. So Perek Chav Beis. Let's take a look again. So here's the pasuk. V'chein tasa l'chol aveda sachicha asher tovad. After we already finished the identifying the four species. V'chein tasa l'chol aveda sachicha that asher tovad. Asher tovad mimenu. Every word counts. Asher tovad mimenu. Umitzasa, and you found it. So the Tanakama says from the word tovad that you lost, it has to be worth a shava pruta. Rabbi Yehuda says umotsasa, and you found it, it has to be worth shava pruta. My benayu, frek the Gemara, what's the chilik if you learn it from tovad or motsasa? What's the big deal? Amabaya mashmos dorshan ikabenaya. It doesn't change anything. You need a shava pruta, but it's the mashmos. It's how you learn it out. We're going to see in a minute what he means. It's the mashmos, how you learn it out, that matters. Mar nafkale me'asher toivad. That from the pasuk of the word asher toivad, or mar nafkale mitzasa. Now the Gemara is going to go through a series of questions. If the Tanakama says it's from toivad, what does he need the word mitzasa? If Rabbi Yehuda says it's mitzasa, what does he need the word toivad?
Same exact situation as we were.
That's right. But when he says mashmos, he means that one of the words is superfluous. Either according to the Tanakama, the word mitzasa is superfluous,
right?
Because it's a repetition. Because if all we're learning is shava pruta, we already learned it from one word. What do we need two words to teach a shava pruta? So now the whole next Gemara, which we're not going to have all that much time, comes to teach us back and forth. And you see this in the Gemara often is when two Amaroim, let's say, are disputing the source of something, then each one asks the other one, so what do you do with this? How are you going to learn pshat in this? So that's what he means by mashmos is so let's just start the first one. We'll learn the first one, and then we'll pick it up next week. Says the Gemara, according to the Tanakhama that uses the word toivad, what are you going to do with mitzasa? Why do you need the mitzasa? So he says, there's an Amora whose name is Ribbenei. The Amar Ribbenei umatzasa the osi liyode mashma. So there is we had this discussion, by the way, in the past, but let me just refresh. Is Shabbos Aveda applied to a non-Jew? It says in the Torah, Hoshef Tishive, but it also says, Lo'achicha. Who is your achicha? A goy is not your achicha. A yid is your achicha. So the question arises, if you have to return to your achicha, are you mechuyev to return to a non-Jew? Yeah, mipnei tikkun olam, mipnei shalom shalva. Okay, there's all other reasons. But lahalacha, are you chayiv to return? So there's a discussion in the Gemara that it depends. What does it depend on? If, according to one mandam, if you find it and it's right there, yeah, you should return it to the non-Jew too. Of course, it came into your hand very easy. You should return it. Now, another mandam says, you know what? If you have to be matriach yourself to find it, and then you find it, you have no achrayas to return it to the goy. In other words, if it's easy come, easy go. But if you have to work hard to find it, you searched for it, whatever, and then you saw it, and you said, "Oh, now my brother is announcing that he lost this item. Sure, I'll return it to him, even though it took me half an hour to find it." So that's the machlokes generally between those who say you have to return it to a non-Jew and those who say you don't have to return it. It now depends on whether or not you were matriach. Right?
Why doesn't Yiyush come into the equation here?
Say it again.
Doesn't Yiyush come into the equation? I mean, if a
No, there's no years. In other words, someone lost it, and he figured he wasn't Yayish. He wasn't Yayish because he figured, okay, it'll be found. Okay. Now, and so this animal is running around or whatever it is, and somebody looks in the bushes and he finds it, and lo and behold, he finds it. Okay, Hashef to Shive, you have to return it. What happens if it belongs to a non-Jew? So the machlokes whether or not you have to return it. But even according to the Manda Amar, who says l'chayra that if you find it easy, you should return it. And what do we say here? The Kedaribene, the Amar Ribene, but Sasa the Asil Yode Mashma. In other words, when you saw it, it already you found it. You didn't have to search
it
for
came
it.
easy to him. It
It
like
came
fell
easy
into
to
his hands almost.
Right. And you only have to return it to a Jew. So according to Ribene, if you find it and it's easy, meaning you didn't do any search, you still don't have to return it to a non-Jew. How do I know that? So that's what Umutsasa comes to teach us. So according to the Tanna Kama, who says I learned it from Tovad, from that I lost it, what do you do with the word Matsasa? According to Ribene, you learn from Matsasa that even if you found it easy, you don't have to return it to a non-Jew. That's what you learn from Matsasa. That's what you learn. Now, what about the other way around? According to the Rabbi Yehuda, who says I learned Shava Pruta from Mitzasa, from I found it. Hi Asher Tovad, my Ovidle. What's he going to do with Asher Tovad? What does he need Asher Tovad for? So he answers the Kid Rabbi Yochanan. You know why I need Tovad? I need because of what Rabbi Yochanan said. What did Rabbi Yochanan say? Rabbi Yochanan from Shimon Bar Yochai, first of the wide lines. Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Shimon Bar Yochai, remember, a few weeks ago, we had the Gemara that says if there is a sudden rush of water that runs over the embankment and takes everything and literally throws it downriver, then there's no more, you don't have to announce. It's gone, right? It will be said it by the sea also if the ocean comes in. But if the river, in other words, you have this I don't know, a tsunami, or you had an earthquake or something, and there was tons of water that overflowed the river, and it's gone. There's years, it's gone forever, right? So menayin la'aveda sheshot v'nor shimater shenema kein tasa l'chol avedas achicha. You know how I know it? Because it says in the pasuk. Because I learned it out from Mitzasa, but it says in the pasuk. Kol avedas achicha asher tovad mimenu u'mitzasa misha avda himenu mitzuya etzel kod adam yatsasa zu she'avuda himenu ve'ena mitzuya etzel kol adam. You know how I learn it, says the Gemara? Because it says l'chol avedas achicha, and I'm going to learn out from avedas achicha that if your brother lost something, but anybody else could find it, then you're mechuyev to announce it when you find it. But if your brother lost it and nobody could find it, why? Because it went downriver with the overflow of the water, then you don't have to return it. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says, I learned Shava Pruta of Mitzasa, what do I do with the word Asher Tovad? Tovad comes to tell you, according to Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Choi, that you only have to return something that I lost, but you can find it. But if I lost it and you can't find it, why? Because it's 10 miles downriver, you don't have to return it. So that's how these two Amoroim answer the question, what do I do with the other word in the pasuk? Okay, so we'll stop here because we go a lot further, but at least we see, and again, this is not novel to this Gemara, that oftentimes when there are two words that there's a machlokes, you can learn the same shot from two words, you always have to answer, what is the other word telling me?
So is this closed? Does this answer this, and this is the end of this piece, or does this go on?
No. We're going to go on now
Oh, okay.
for the rest of this daf,
Okay.
going back and forth because there are other words in the pasuk.
Okay, all right.
I'm emphasizing Asher Tovad, but it says Mimenu. The word Mimenu is going to be a very instrumental
Okay,
word.
all
So
right.
we're going to go through this in greater detail, but at least to start off, we understand that the machlokes between the Tanna Kamma and Rabbi Yehuda, we can answer that even though they differ on where you learn Shava Pruta, at least they learned something else out from the other word that they're
Right,
not.
and if it really did go further than most people would ever have a havamin of getting it back, then
Right.
Okay.
Right. So according to the Tanna Kamma, he says the Chiddush of Ravina that even if you find something easy, you don't have to return it to a non-Jew.
Right.
And according to Rabbi Yehuda, the word Toiva comes to tell me that I only have to return something that is findable. Someone else can find it. But if it's not findable, why? Because the river took it 10 miles downstream.
Then even if you found it, it's deemed not findable.
Then there's no mitzvah to return. Exactly. So Mitzvah Shem, it's a fascinating Gemara, and we're going to continue next week. But that's the start of it. Is the machlokes between the Tanna Kamma and Rabbi Yehuda. All right, Afelach and Chana can continue to enjoy the last day. And a good Mechaydish and a good week, Mitzvah Shem.
Amen.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.